Good morning. Welcome back to our Bible study time. We appreciate you joining us, and I trust that you are blessed by what you hear and blessed by the Word of God. I want to speak to you today from the book of Ephesians, chapter 4, verses 17 through 19. This is probably going to be part one. Matter of fact, I am reasonably sure that this will be part one. I want to use for a thought or for a title, Symptoms of Moral Madness. Symptoms of Moral Madness. I think we all agree that these are interesting times, if nothing less. They're certainly challenging times, but they're not new. Paul here in the book of Ephesians some 2,000 years ago addressed some of the same problems that we are having today in society. Issues that question the madness or the sanity of one's mind. And I hope today to shine some light on what's going on in our world, not just in America, but in the world in general. We ask ourselves sometimes, what are they thinking? What were they thinking when they made such and such a decision? Well, I want to try to bring some light to that subject today. So let me read to you from the book of Ephesians, chapter 4, beginning with verse 17. And as always, well, most of the time anyway, I'm reading from the King James. So I'm reading from the King James this morning. Paul writes, "This I say therefore, and testify in the Lord, that ye henceforth walk not as other Gentiles walk, in the vanity of their minds, having the understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them because of the blindness of their hearts, or heart, who being past feelings have given themselves over unto lasciviousness, to work all uncleanness with greediness." And so Paul says here in verse 17 that the Gentiles had given themselves, verse 19, had given themselves over to a lifestyle that is anti-God. He admonishes and encourages this church at Ephesus to be careful not to live that lifestyle. And here Paul takes the time by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit to explain to you and I exactly what he's talking about. And so here in verse 17, Paul writes, "This I say, and testify in the Lord, that you henceforth walk not as the other Gentiles walk, in the vanity of their minds." So Paul says, he implies to them that this was your lifestyle at one time, all right? But it's not your lifestyle anymore. And I want to say to you, the listener this morning, that this was your lifestyle at one time, but it's not anymore. Paul says here in verse 17, he uses a number of words, and I've kind of broken this message up into about 3-4 pieces here, something like that. And so the first piece here is the human condition. Paul describes the human condition. And I want to say to you that he's addressing, yes, a Gentile church, but this is true across the board. It's true for Jew or Gentile. All right, there are no exceptions to the rule when it comes to being controlled by sin prior to one's conversion. So Paul said, "This I say, I encourage you," he says, "and testify in the Lord, that you henceforth walk not as the Gentiles walk." And then he describes, he says, in the vanity of your mind. The word walk, it describes one's lifestyle. It's speaking of one's lifestyle, the way you live day in and day out. The word vanity here in the King James is futility. Let me read to you what I have here. I've written something that is incapable of producing any useful results. Pointless. What was it that the unsaved Ephesians, those Gentiles, what was it that they were unable to achieve? Their minds were unable to receive revelation knowledge from God, and therefore their minds were ineffective, unsuccessful, useless, when it came to understanding God and God's ways. Now think about that a moment. How many times have we talked to people and they say, well, I just don't understand the Bible? And what about you and I? I've been saved now 47 years. I remember before I got saved at 24. I remember not understanding the Bible. I'd pick it up. I couldn't get past those 2-3 words in the beginning. You know, God created the heavens and I was done. It didn't make any sense to me. And what's interesting now, I have to smile because now I can't put it down. You know, back then I couldn't pick it up. Now I can't put it down. So Paul says, walk not in the vanity of your mind. Let me tell you something. Excuse me. Your mind was not saved when you got saved. It needs to be renewed. Paul says, renew your mind. All right? Your mind needs to be renewed. Paul encourages them here not to walk in the vanity, the uselessness of their mind, but renew your mind. All right? Your mind wasn't saved when you got saved. I got saved 47 years ago. My mind was not saved. My spirit was saved. My body wasn't saved. My mind wasn't saved. But my spirit was saved. I've got to renew, and I've had to renew my mind. And that's a constant process because the word mind here, this word has different nuances. The basic idea is to perceive, understand. Also, it describes one's thinking ability because it is used to describe the thinking process. It has the nuances of opinion, purpose, plan, or results. It also can have the idea of disposition or one's moral attitude. Let me read to you what Donald Hodges said. He said, in the present passage, the concept of disposition or moral attitude fits best. The original purpose of the mind was to be able to comprehend God's revelation. But due to the fall, a person's mind is unable to accomplish that goal. Hence, the futility of the mind conveys the idea of not being able to perceive the revelation of God for which it was designed. Thus, its moral attitude or disposition prevents it from achieving its goal. He goes on to say that the believer is not to walk in this kind of moral purposelessness displayed by the Gentiles. End of quote. Didn't do a great job quoting that. Paul writes to you and writes to the Ephesians, writing to you and I also. And he says, don't live like the Gentiles live. He said, you lived like that at one time, but don't live like that. Don't allow your unrenewed mind to govern your lifestyle. He says that their minds are purposelessness. It has no direction. And he's describing for you and I the human condition here. Think about that a moment. Then he tells us in verse 18, and I have entitled that, Navigating a Moral Maze Without a Moral Light. Navigating a moral maze without a moral light. So let me read to you verse 18. I'm going to break it up, verse 18a and then verse 18b. So 18a, I've entitled that, or given it a subtitle, No Headlamps. Let me read to you. Having the understanding darkened, he says. So Paul says to you and I in verse 17, let me find the right chapter here. In verse 17, he writes, This I say, therefore, and testify in the Lord that ye henceforth walk not as other Gentiles walk, in the vanity of their mind, the emptiness of their mind, the uselessness of their minds, having the understanding darkened. So Paul says that their understanding is darkened. There are no headlamps, as I put it here in my subtitle. The word darkness means to be blind. Blindness, a mind that is incapable of receiving revelation from God. Blind to spiritual truths, blind to spiritual things that God would share with you and I, that he desires to share with his creation. The Bible said in the cool of the day, God would come down and commune with Adam. Adam's mind was capable of perceiving and understanding God's revelation. His mind was capable of having a conversation with God. But when man fell, they lost that ability. The mind became darkened, having their understanding darkened. The word understanding is the process of thinking or reasoning. It is the ability to reach an opinion, all right, conclusion. It is the ability to comprehend spiritual truth and then come to a conclusion about the fact that it's true. So their understanding was darkened. He goes on to say, and this is part B, they were alienated. Alienation, was the consequences of this darkness. Let me read to you here. Verse 18, having the understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God. Now, what are we talking about? We're talking about moral madness, symptoms of moral madness. The desire to negotiate the moral maze without moral light. Paul says that their understanding was darkened. He says that they are alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance, the spiritual ignorance that is in them, and that is because of blindness. So he says that they are alienated, they are cut off, they're excluded, they are estranged from the life of God. They are shut out of fellowship. There is therefore now no fellowship between the unsaved individual and God. There's no communication. There's no communication. He said they're alienated from the life. And the word life is it's the God kind of life. It's Zoe. Jesus said, I've come that you might have life and have that life more abundantly. Have that life in an abundance. And so the idea here is that because of the darkness that is in them, the inability to receive revelation from God, they're cut off. The unsaved individual is cut off from fellowship with God, cut off from the life of God. Jesus said, I've come that you might have life, and then not having that life, being born again, leads into this deep love affair with God. Quick love affair commercial. If you're not having a love affair, get rid of whatever you got going on with God and develop a love affair. Ask God to help you understand how to do that. I'm having a love affair with God, and I have been now for years. Alienation, the consequences of darkness, alienated from the life of God. He goes on to say, being alienated from the life of God through the ignorance, a lack of perception. I have three things here I need to read to you. A lack of the ability to understand, to perceive spiritual things. This ignorance is a result of their rejection of God's manifested knowledge of himself through the creation. Romans chapter 1. We're going to go there in a minute. That's the first thing I want you to see. Because of their willful rejection of this knowledge, their reasoning process became faulty, useless, senseless. Irrational hearts became darkened. Because of their willful act of refusing to embrace this revelation, they were without excuse before God. He says, because of the blindness of their heart. The word blindness is an interesting word. It basically means a callous, a hardness. All right? They hardened their hearts. They said, we don't want God. I'm going to show you that. I'm going to show you that in Romans. Their understandings were incapable of receiving revelation knowledge from God because they were alienated. They were alienated from God's life because of the spiritual ignorance that was in them. And that was because of the spiritual blindness that was in it. And that was because they rejected what they could know about God. So I have here in my notes, why this blindness? Well, because they rejected God's revelation. Well, what revelation, Brother A? What revelation did God give them? Well, go with me to the book of Romans, chapter 1. And I'm just going to show you a couple things, because this is part one. I'm going to come back and really jump into Romans here, chapter 1, beginning with verse 18, really dive into this thing and try to dissect it and make it make a little more sense. I wrote here in my notes, why this moral blindness? And I answered it, because they rejected God's revelation of himself. Rejection of nature's revelation of God. And so let me begin to read to you in Romans chapter 1, verse 18. Just want to print out a couple of things to you here. And then we're going to, as I said, we're going to come back to Romans. So here in verse 18, he says, for the wrath of God, now I want you to understand that what Paul is talking about over in Ephesians, he expounds over here in Romans. Real quickly, go with me to verse 19, Ephesians 4, verse 19. Who being past feelings have given themselves over. And I want you to make a note of the word given here. Because what it means is they volunteered their lives to sin, giving themselves over unto lasciviousness to work all uncleanness with greediness. So there was a moral blindness here, and that blindness is a result of the fact that they rejected the revelation that God had given them about himself. Now let's understand that Paul was talking, I don't want to get ahead of myself, Paul was talking about the creation itself. And the creation, that revelation can't lead you to salvation, but what it can do is make you say, there's a God somewhere. My mom said to God, one day she shared this with me, I was in the service when she got saved. And the church where she was going was a particular religion. They didn't teach anything. They didn't preach anything. You didn't have to live anything. And so she told me, she said, I stepped outside of the church and I said to God, God, if I'm going to lose my soul, to direct me where I can get saved. And God began to move in her life. David said it a little bit differently. We're really going to get into this when we get into Romans. David said, when I considered the heavens and the earth, God. In other words, David said, I looked at the heavens and the earth and I realized, God, there's a God out there who created the heavens. I mean, he was Jewish and they had the law and they taught him about God, but the creation really drove that truth home to his heart, that there's a God. And so he says here in Romans, let me go back to Romans chapter 1 with me. If you get there before me, wait on me, I'm coming. Beginning with verse 18, he says, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold or hinder the truth in unrighteousness. All right, he goes on to say, because that which may be known of God is manifested in them, for God has shown it unto them. For the invisible, now listen, for the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that ye are without excuse. So Paul says in writing to this church that God has given us a glimpse through creation into himself, into his character, into his power, into who he is. And that truth should make one stand at attention and say, God, how do I approach you? How do I come to know you? Verse 22, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into images made like to corruptible men and birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. They had lost their minds morally. They expressed their moral madness. Verse 24 says, wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their hearts to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. I want to read to you what James Montgomery Boice said here. Boice, I'm not sure how he pronounces his name. He writes in his book on Romans, page 134. In verses 21 through 32, Paul speaks of a downward inclination of the race by which the world, having rejected God and therefore being judicially abandoned by God, is given up to evil. It is set on a course that leads to perversion and ends up in abasement, in which people call good evil and evil good. Human depravity and the misery involved are the revelation of God. Here's what he's saying. God gave them over to inherit an inherent tendency of moral evil that would lead or produce misery in their lives. Paul says, now listen to what he said. Perhaps I should read it to you. Here in verse 18 in Romans chapter 1, Paul says, for the wrath of God is revealed. And yes, we could include a lot of stuff. We could include the flood, God's judgment upon Sodom and Gomorrah, God's judgment upon Adam and Eve when he kicked them out of the garden. We could go on down the list. However, and all of that would be true. But I agree with Mr. Montgomery here, that Paul is driving at something a little more present. That sin leads to sin, that sin begets sin. And when God endeavors to interrupt that sin in your life, if you respond properly, you get saved. But if not, that sin is going to lead to more sin, and you're going to end up in a situation where you're just going to be miserable. Now, let me break it down for you. So a young man comes along the scene, and maybe he came out of a godly home, and maybe he didn't. But he takes that first sip of alcohol, and he likes it, and he's partying, and he's having just a wonderful time. And here it is now, he's 20. Here it is some 40 years later, and he's an alcoholic. He's broke down, and maybe he's a functioning alcoholic, and maybe he's not. Maybe he's on drugs. Maybe he's not. But that he's miserable. Sin begets sin. Sin begets misery. Paul says here in verse 19 of the book of Ephesians, he writes, who, being past feelings, have given themselves over unto lasciviousness to work all uncleanness. The word given, the idea is to volunteer. They volunteered themselves. They said, this is a lifestyle that I want to live. And so, in their pursuit of happiness in this world, they are miserable, absolutely miserable. Young man went to a carnival where I grew up. They used to have these carnivals that would come through the area once or twice a year. And we had this big, huge open field. And so they would set up their equipment there. They would set up their rides and etc. Young man went to the carnival and he found this lion in this cage, and it said, the sign on the cage said ride for free. And so this young man said to the gatekeeper, I'd like to ride. And so the gatekeeper looked at him and smiled and said, you go right ahead, only open the gate. Young man went in and got on this line and began to ride. He looked back at all his friends, and he was smiling, and he was having just a wonderful time. And that lion stopped all of a sudden and looked at him and threw him off of his back and began to maul him. Well, it's not a true story in the sense that this young man really rode the lion, but it's a true story in the sense that that young man thought he could ride the line called life. And at some junction along the way, the lion stopped, bucked him off his back, and began to maul him. And if Jesus Christ hadn't come along, that young man would have been mauled to death. I know, because I was that young man. Life mauled me. And thank God at 24, God saved me Paul said they volunteered to lasciviousness, sensuousness, to work all uncleanness with a greediness. Paul said that they were, the NIV says, it uses the word impurity. And then the word greediness, again, the NIV says it well, with a continuous lust for more. Moral symptoms of moral madness. We look around today in the world and we say, what is wrong with that individual? I tell you what's wrong. They're blind. They're blind to the things of God. They are morally insane. Don't do that. Don't pat yourself on the back. But you and I also were morally insane before Jesus Christ came along and saved us. Now, this is part one of symptoms of moral madness. Part two, I'm going to really jump into Romans there and really endeavor to expound that in such a way that you will not only understand it, but appreciate it. I want to close with a couple of verses here. In Romans chapter 12, verse 2, Paul writes, and be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Paul says, and be not conformed, but be ye transformed. Let that transformation, let that metamorphosis begin to take place. But I want you to notice something here, that metamorphosis, that transformation will not happen without the renewing, of your mind. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renew. It's your responsibility to renew your mind through the word of God. Paul writes in Ephesians 4:23, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind. Excuse me. Your responsibility to renew your mind. It's my responsibility to renew my mind. So the next time you go to church, don't go to sleep when the preacher's preaching. Don't nod off. Don't let your mind drift. Pay attention. Allow the Spirit of God to write his word in the heart of your mind. Until next time, may God bless you, may God keep you, and thank you. Listen for part two. All right, bye-bye.